Nora Bennett had lost everything before a billionaire hired her to play mother to his son. But what no one anticipated was that she would arrive at the very first meeting with her own daughter, asleep on her shoulder. On time. Almost. Nora Bennett stood in front of Beaumont Restaurant with a sleeping child on her shoulder, an old handbag caught at her elbow, and the high heels she hadn't worn for 11 months. Maya was heavier than she remembered. Or perhaps Nora was simply more tired than before. The girl's braided hair pressed against her mother's neck, the small beads softly touching each other with every step Nora took, creating a sound so thin it was almost swallowed by the rain outside. The woman at the reception desk looked at the reservation list, then looked at the 7-year-old child. "Mrs. Bennett?" Nora nodded. She had no breath left to explain right away. Table number 12 was near the window. The man sitting there stood up when he saw her. Malcolm Whitmore was taller than in his profile photo, wearing a charcoal suit without a single crease, his hair cut short with a few gray strands at the temples. The watch beneath his shirt cuff was probably worth more than what Nora had earned in the past year. His gaze paused on Maya. Just a second. But Nora noticed. She had lived too long by reading the small changes on other people's faces. The landlord's pity when she asked to delay the rent. The manager's suspicion when he saw the gap in her employment record. The customer's impatience when she delivered food 3 minutes late. "I'm sorry," she said. "The babysitter canceled 20 minutes before I left home. I was about to call the recruitment agency to cancel the meeting." Malcolm pulled out the bench seat beside him. "But you still came. I need the job." The air between them fell silent. Nora could have said that the neighbor who usually helped her was working the night shift. She could have mentioned the car repair bill sitting in her bag, the rent still owed, and the notice that the after-school program would stop accepting Maya if she didn't pay by Friday. But she was too tired of turning her life into an excuse. Malcolm signaled the staff to bring an extra pillow. Nora set Maya down very slowly, tucking her folded jacket under her daughter's head. The girl stirred, tightened her grip on the small paper box she was holding against her chest, then fell back asleep. "What is your daughter holding?" Malcolm asked. "My old business cards." Nora sat down across from him. The black dress she was wearing used to fit better. It had been bought the year she became the youngest chief financial officer in the history of Lattice Health Analytics. Tonight, its hem had been re-sewn by her own hand under the kitchen light, after finishing her office cleaning shift at 2 in the morning. Malcolm placed a folder on the table. The front cover bore the name of a premium family staffing agency in Boston. Nora's background had been checked, her education verified, and her past work cross-referenced before the meeting was arranged. Even so, she still didn't understand why a tech billionaire would need to hire a stranger to play his son's mother for one evening. Why would a billionaire ask a complete stranger to pretend to be his son's mother? And what had happened to the little boy that made such an unusual arrangement feel necessary? Nora believed she had come to this meeting because she desperately needed the money. But before the evening was over, she would discover that Malcolm and his son were carrying a kind of loss that wealth could not repair. Before we continue, if you believe one unexpected meeting can change the direction of several lives, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. And tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We're always grateful to know how far these stories travel. "Ms. Carter said you've read the confidentiality agreement," Malcolm said. "I've read it. Any issues?" 13 issues. For the first time, his expression changed. Nora opened the folder, flipping to page 4. She pointed to the clause on image usage, civil liability, and the scope of confidentiality. Her voice wasn't loud, nor did it waver. The numbers, the wording, and the structure of the risks remained intact in her mind, as if the 11 months of serving tables, making deliveries, and mopping floors had never happened. "The contract allows your family office to use my image indefinitely," she said. "It also holds me liable if my true identity is exposed, even if the leak comes from your side. Also, the $5,000 amount is listed as a performance fee, but this work isn't just a performance." "Then what would you call it?" Nora looked over at Maya. "It's asking a child to live inside a story that isn't real." Malcolm leaned back in his chair. Outside the glass, black cars glided over the rain-wet street. He didn't seem used to being questioned. Perhaps in his world, people usually took the money first and figured out how to agree to it later. "You still applied. Just because I need the money doesn't mean I don't understand what I'm doing." A staff member set a glass of water in front of Nora. She thanked him, wrapping both hands around the cold glass but not drinking. On her wrist was still a red mark left by the delivery bag strap that had dug in that afternoon. Malcolm saw it. Nora pulled her sleeve down. Why would someone with a degree in accounting from Howard, a master's in finance, and 12 years of experience apply for this job? That question had come up in every interview for nearly a year, only in more polite forms. Why should we trust you? Why would a chief financial officer apply for data entry? Why does your name appear in an ethics investigation? Because I can't do my old job anymore, Nora said. Why? That's a long story. I've set aside this whole evening for this meeting. Nora nearly laughed. The man in front of her could buy another evening whenever he wished. She, on the other hand, had swapped shifts with 2 people, paid the babysitter in advance, and lost that money when the sitter canceled. From the back of the room, a boy in a dark blue sweater stepped out from a chair hidden behind a large potted plant. Nora turned around. He was about 9 years old, thin, both hands gripping a piece of paper that had been crumpled many times. His eyes didn't look at Malcolm. They stopped on the sleeping Maya, then shifted to Nora. "That's Oliver," Malcolm said, "my son." Nora understood immediately that the interview had never been just between the 2 of them. Oliver stepped closer to the table and placed the crumpled paper in front of her. At the top of the page, written in pencil, were the words, "The story about my mom." The space below was almost entirely blank. The boy looked at Nora for a long time, as though trying to find on her face some sign that adults usually hide. "If you say you'll come," Oliver asked, "will you really come?" Nora didn't answer right away. She looked at the crumpled paper on the table. The title line had been written carefully, but the space below was so blank it gave the impression the child had sat before it for a long time without finding a single memory safe enough to put down. The right corner of the page still bore a fingernail mark. Oliver had crumpled it, then unfolded it again, as though still undecided whether he wanted to keep the story or erase it. "If I promised," Nora said, "I will come." Oliver didn't smile. He only nodded very slightly, then pulled the empty chair beside his father. Malcolm didn't touch his son. He let him sit down on his own, place both hands on his knees on his own, and choose his own distance from the adults deciding a part of his life. Maya stirred on the bench. The box of business cards slipped from her hand, fell onto the carpet, and its lid popped open. Dozens of cream-colored cards scattered out, each bearing the name Nora Bennett, along with the title she was not currently allowed to use. Nora bent down to pick them up. Oliver bent down too. He picked one up, read it very slowly, then looked at her. "You used to be a boss?" Nora gathered the remaining cards into the box. "Used to be someone who knew what she had to do the next morning." The answer left Malcolm silent. There are people who lose their job but still keep the shape of their life intact. They still go home to the same house, still use the same account, still call old friends and say they're just taking some time off. Nora had lost the entire future that had once been laid out for her. Each of her mornings now began with checking the delivery app, the cleaning schedule, and the amount left after subtracting for gas. She told them just enough. Nora used to hang her Howard University diploma and her master's degree in finance behind her desk, next to a photo of her mother and grandmother standing on either side of her on graduation day. Those 2 women had worked their whole lives so that Nora would never have to walk into any room feeling like she was asking permission to be there. She had co-founded Lattice with Derek Vaughn, the husband she trusted. When the company had only 14 employees, Nora built the entire financial control system. She knew every layer of security, every approval process, and every trace a sum of money had to leave behind. Then Nora discovered Derek's affair, betraying their marriage with Taryn Ellis, her deputy. A week later, Nora's system access was locked. 3 weeks later, transactions bearing her electronic signature appeared in a complaint filed with the state's accounting licensing board. Her lawyer at the time advised Nora to sign an agreement suspending her CPA license while the board conducted its review, promising that cooperating would help the case conclude faster. It didn't conclude fast. Positions that didn't require a license still turned Nora down because the investigation hadn't closed. Derek controlled the servers, the client records, and the professional references. Companies in the same industry didn't want to hire someone in a dispute with her own former firm. Her career wasn't destroyed by a single ruling. It was worn away by people unwilling to take the risk of standing next to her name. "Can't you prove you didn't sign it?" Malcolm asked. "To prove it, I need the original data. The company says the old backups were overwritten." Nora didn't mention the night she left the house in Brookline with 2 suitcases, her old laptop, and Maya asking when they'd be back in her own bedroom. Nor did she mention that the house, the joint account, and most of the shares were all held up in the dispute, while the cash had been funneled into paying off corporate obligations Derek had created himself. They never went back to that room. Oliver folded the paper in half. He might not understand words like license or original data, but he understood the feeling of adults taking something that belonged to you and then telling the story in a way that benefited them. "What about your mom?" Nora asked. Malcolm looked at his son before answering. Oliver turned his face toward the window. His mother's name was Camille. She was a fashion photographer, living between New York, Paris, and Milan. After the divorce, the trips grew longer. The calls grew shorter. Expensive gifts appeared in place of the mornings she had promised to be there. 3 months ago, Camille said she would come back for Hawthorne School's family story night. Oliver had told the whole class. He picked out photos, wrote the title, and left the memory section blank because he wanted to wait and finish it together with her. That morning, an email arrived from Camille's assistant. She had a new shoot scheduled in Barcelona. "How many times has this happened?" Nora asked. Malcolm didn't answer. "The 6th time," Oliver said. The number landed on the table lighter than a spoon, but Nora felt it touch the softest place in her heart. Maya had once stood in front of the apartment door for 2 hours on a day Derek promised to come pick her up. She wore her shoes, put on her backpack, and refused to eat dinner for fear her father would arrive right as she was chewing. By 9 o'clock, Nora had to carry her to bed with her shoes still on her feet. "Ms. Carter contacted a premium family staffing agency," Malcolm said. "They screened the candidates. I just didn't stop her." He hadn't hired a woman to deceive the school. He was trying to lay a different face over a broken promise before it became a memory his son would carry for the rest of his life. "You know this could make everything worse." "I know." Maya woke up while Nora was restacking the business cards. She rubbed her eyes, looked at Malcolm, then at Oliver. No one had time to explain. Maya took a card from the box and folded its small corners with movements she had made hundreds of times in waiting rooms and in the back seat of the car. A paper star slowly took shape between her fingers. Maya set it down in front of Malcolm. "You can keep it," she said. "Mommy can't use this name yet." Nora froze. Malcolm didn't look at the star. He looked at her, as though he had just understood that the child in front of him had learned to name her mother's absence with a simpler sentence, so as not to hurt the adults around her. Nora pulled the contract closer, flipped to the blank page at the back, and wrote 3 conditions. No one may require Oliver to call her mom when no outsider is present. No one may fabricate additional false memories. After the night at school, Malcolm must tell his son the truth. Nora's pen stopped as Oliver reached out and pulled the contract toward himself. Oliver didn't read those terms the way a child reads a contract. He simply looked at each line, slowly, then placed his finger on the last sentence. Malcolm must tell his son the truth. He held his finger there longer than necessary, as though wanting to make sure the ink wouldn't simply vanish once the adults changed their minds. "I agree," Oliver said. Malcolm looked at his son. Something close to shame passed over his face, not because his son had heard too much, but because he had grown used to protecting himself from promises. He signed beneath Nora's name, then handed the contract to Renee Carter. No one shook hands. The agreement began with a child checking whether the adults had the courage to keep their word. 3 days later, Nora stood in the second-floor dressing room of the Whitmore house, in front of a row of dresses wrapped in thin white fabric. Renee had prepared them according to measurements taken from her file. There was wine-colored silk, black velvet, pearl-toned satin. Dresses beautiful in a way that never had to ask whether the wearer could afford them. Nora touched one, then pulled her hand back. "I can't wear this." Renee stood near the door, hands folded in front of her. "No one's asking you to keep it. That's not the issue." Nora knew she was reacting more strongly than necessary. But for nearly a year, everything expensive had reminded her of the things that had once been hers on paper, then vanished after a single signature. She didn't want to walk into Oliver's school in a dress Malcolm chose, in shoes Malcolm bought, looking like a woman built out of his money. Maya sat on the rug, watching her mother with quiet eyes. She wore a yellow sweater, her hair neatly braided with 2 small sun-shaped clips. When Nora opened the old cloth bag she had brought, Maya immediately crawled closer. Inside was a deep blue dress, wrapped in a towel to keep it from wrinkling further. Nora had worn it the day Lattice closed its first funding round. Back then, Derek had stood backstage, adjusting her zipper, telling her the room full of older men wouldn't know what had happened until Nora made them sign. She had walked out, presented for 37 minutes straight, answered 16 questions, and left the hotel with the investment that kept the company alive for 2 more years. The dress still fit, but the zipper stuck at the back. Renee said nothing. She simply took out a sewing kit, sat down behind Nora, and picked apart the old stitches that had hardened over time. Maya held the pin box with both hands. The room was spacious and quiet, but Nora suddenly remembered the mornings in their small apartment, changing into her serving uniform while tying her daughter's hair, both of them standing before the cracked mirror in the corner. When Renee pulled the zipper up, Nora saw herself. Not the woman on the cleaning staff badge, not the mother always bending down to check prices before putting milk in the cart, nor entirely the female executive in the old photographs, the one who once believed competence could protect her from every betrayal. The woman in the mirror was thinner, harder, but still there. Maya stepped closer, touching the part of the dress where the light pooled into a streak of blue. "You look like the graduation picture." Nora turned around. "I'm still me, I know." Maya's answer was so calm it made Nora turn away. Her daughter didn't need Nora to become who she used to be. She only needed her mother to stop acting as though that smart, beautiful woman full of dreams had died in the house they'd had to leave. The evening at Hawthorne School began with the smell of construction paper, cold coffee, and rain-damp coats. Families stood in clusters beneath posters drawn in crayon. Nora walked beside Malcolm but didn't touch him. Still, she could clearly feel the eyes turning toward them. A few people recognized Malcolm. A few others looked at her longer. Nora had thought she would hate that. But when Malcolm leaned down to ask whether she wanted to leave before the program began, he didn't look at her like a mother in need of rescue. His gaze rested on her face, calm and direct, as though waiting for the answer of a woman who had the right to choose. "He'll stay," Nora said. Oliver stood a few steps away, holding the pressed flat sheet of paper. He wore the same dark blue sweater from the restaurant. Maya walked over, tucked the small paper star into his shirt pocket, then stepped back. Oliver placed his hand over it as if checking that it was still there. When his name was called, the audience applauded with just enough politeness. Oliver stepped up to the podium. Nora and Malcolm stood behind him as the teacher had instructed. The overhead lights made the paper in his hands look even whiter. He began reading about a mother who lived in Paris, who always remembered birthdays, always called on time, always came home whenever her child needed her. His voice was even, too even. Nora saw the erased spots on the paper. Every beautiful sentence had been written over another line. She didn't know what the old line said, but she knew the feeling of having to bend the truth to fit what others wanted to hear. Oliver reached the sentence, "My mom has never broken a promise." His throat caught. In the front row, a child turned to a friend. At the back of the room, a phone was raised, its lens aimed at the podium and at Nora's face. Malcolm stood very straight, his hands clenched together. He didn't step forward. Nora left her position. She walked up beside Oliver, resting her hand on the edge of the podium without touching him. The paper trembled in his small fingers. The whole room waited for the woman introduced as his mother to continue the story. Nora looked out over the rows of seats, then turned to Oliver. "We don't have to read the part that isn't true," she said. Oliver looked at her. In his eyes was the fear of a child who had just been given permission to tell the truth, but didn't yet know who that truth would disappoint. The paper trembled once more. Then he lowered it, revealing pencil lines erased until the paper's surface had grown thin. Nora didn't tell it for him. She stood beside him, close enough for Oliver to know he wasn't left alone, but not so close as to turn his silence into something needing rescue. In the audience, a chair shifted slightly. Someone cleared their throat. A child dropped a crayon. Malcolm still stood behind them. His face had tightened, but he kept his word. "My mom didn't come," Oliver said. No one moved. "She said she would come, but she didn't come." His voice was so small the microphone almost failed to catch it, and yet the whole room heard it. Perhaps because true words rarely need to be spoken loudly. They only need to appear in the place people have grown used to covering with beautiful stories. Nora looked out over the rows of seats. She saw a few mothers bow their heads, a father squeeze his daughter's hand, a teacher raise a finger to her lips as two students started to whisper. The phone at the back of the room was still pointed at Nora, with Oliver standing mostly outside the frame. "There are families that don't look like the picture we want to paint," Nora said. "There are people who give birth to us but don't know how to stay. There are people who love us but still let us down. And there are people who don't share our name, who don't appear in the earliest photographs, but when a child turns around, they're still there." She wasn't looking at Malcolm when she said the last part, but she felt him standing still behind her. Oliver clenched the paper. "So what should I say?" Nora looked at the star in his shirt pocket. "Tell them about the person who came today." Oliver turned his head. His gaze passed over Malcolm, then stopped on Maya sitting in the front row, her legs not reaching the floor. She raised her hand, holding nothing, just to let him know she was watching. Oliver folded the paper into quarters and set it down. "My dad isn't good at doing hair," he began, "but he learned how to make toast without burning it. Mrs. Renee always leaves the hallway light on when I can't sleep, and today, someone told me I didn't have to say something that wasn't true." No one applauded right away. The moment was too thin, as if a loud sound could shatter it. Then the clapping began from one corner, spread through the rows, and became a sound that made Oliver lower his head, not out of embarrassment but because he wasn't used to being acknowledged when he wasn't playing the part of a fine, well-adjusted child. After the program, Nora went into the restroom and stood in front of the sink longer than necessary. Her hands were cold. She had been hired to keep a lie, and yet she had broken it in front of hundreds of people. $5,000 could vanish. The rent was still due on Monday. Maya came in, pulled a tissue, and wiped a small smudge of lipstick from the corner of her mother's mouth. "Your lipstick's smudged." Nora bent down and hugged her daughter. Maya didn't understand why her mother was trembling. She simply patted Nora's back in slow rhythms, the same way Nora always did for her after a nightmare. Malcolm waited for them in the hallway. He wasn't angry, nor did he say she had violated the agreement. He handed Nora an envelope with the full payment, along with a confirmation that all obligations had been fulfilled. "I didn't do what you hired me for," Nora said. "You did what my son needed." That was the only thing he said about that evening. 2 days later, the video was shared in the school's parent group. Whoever filmed it had only captured Nora and the podium area. Oliver was barely in frame. The school requested the video be taken down as soon as it was discovered, but a short clip of Nora's words had already been copied elsewhere and drew thousands of views. Most viewers didn't know who she was. They simply called her the woman in the blue dress. Nora didn't read all the comments. She was sitting in her car, waiting for the delivery app to notify her of a new order, when Malcolm called. He didn't bring up the video. He asked whether she could review a set of files for an education fund sponsored by the Whitmore family. The work was purely internal consulting, didn't require her to use her CPA title, didn't require her to sign any public report, and came with a clear contract. Nora was about to decline. Then she looked in the back seat, where Maya was doing homework under the car's dome light because the apartment's circuit breaker had failed again. 3 days later, she sat in the Whitmore family library with 4 boxes of files and a computer with unrestricted access. The smell of paper, coffee, and polished wood pulled her back into a part of her life she had thought was lost. The numbers appeared before her, showing no pity, asking nothing about her divorce, caring nothing for how many floors she had mopped. Within just 40 minutes, Nora found a management fee that had been double-charged for 18 months straight. After 2 hours, she discovered 3 sub-funds paying the same vendor under different names. Malcolm stood at the library door, not interrupting. He watched Nora mark line after line, take off her glasses, retie her naturally curly hair that had begun slipping from its clip, and forget entirely about the cup of coffee going cold beside her. For the first time since meeting her, he didn't see a woman in need of a job. He saw someone who could step into an enormous system, listen to numbers that were lying, and find the exact point where they began to drift from the truth. On the other side of the city, Derek Vaughn sat in Nora's old office when the video from Hawthorne School appeared on his phone screen. He watched it once all the way through, then rewound it to the exact moment Malcolm Whitmore stepped up to stand behind her. He zoomed in on his ex-wife's face. The blue dress was the same dress Nora had worn at the first funding round, the night they'd gone home to the house in Brookline with a cheap bottle of wine and the belief that together they had built something no one could ever take away. Derek remembered zipping up that dress for her. He also remembered that, years later, those same hands had locked Nora's access out of the system before she even had time to understand what was happening. On his desk, a brass nameplate bearing her name still sat in the bottom drawer. Derek hadn't thrown it away. Not out of sentiment. He kept it the way someone keeps the old key to a house that now belongs to them, just to remind himself that there had once been a time when someone else believed they too had the right to walk in. The asset dispute still hadn't concluded, so both sides' lawyers still received periodic income updates. Nora's latest file included a $5,000 transfer from the Whitmore family office, dated the exact week the video appeared. Derek only needed to lay the 2 facts side by side to understand she had been paid for that night at Hawthorne. What worried him wasn't the lie. It was the name Whitmore. Over the following 3 weeks, Nora worked mornings in Malcolm's library and made deliveries in the evenings. The contract with the education fund wasn't enough to change her whole life, but it was enough that she no longer had to check her balance before buying milk. More importantly, Malcolm never called it a favor. Every invoice she sent was paid on time, accompanied by a brief confirmation, the same as with any other professional. Maya and Oliver grew used to sitting at opposite ends of the long table. Oliver did his science homework. Maya read or drew while waiting for her mother. Occasionally, Malcolm would come in carrying 4 cups of hot cocoa, always placing Nora's cup where she wouldn't have to stop working to take it. These gestures were small enough that she could pretend not to notice. But her body noticed before her mind did, her shoulders less tense, her voice less guarded, and on some afternoons she forgot to check the time because she was genuinely doing work she loved. Derek chose one particular evening when she wasn't at the Whitmore house. Nora was serving at a fundraiser at the Fairmont Hotel, wearing a white dress shirt and a black apron tied tightly at her waist. She was carrying a tray of empty glasses through the hallway when she saw him standing by the ballroom door, in the same dark blue suit she'd once helped him pick out for their 8th wedding anniversary. Derek still knew how to appear, as if every room had been prepared for him in advance. "You look well," he said. Nora set the tray down on a side table. Her hands were still steady, but the skin beneath where her old wedding ring used to sit suddenly itched, even though the ring had been sold months ago to cover the apartment deposit. "You shouldn't be here. This is a public event. You didn't come for the event." Derek smiled, the same smile that once made investors believe he could see the future. It had taken Nora too long to understand that smile was never meant for the person across from him. It was meant for his own image, reflected in their eyes. He placed an envelope on the table. Inside was a 17-page agreement. Derek would withdraw the supplementary complaint with the professional board and confirm Nora had no involvement in the transactions under review. In exchange, she would give up any claim to Lattice shares, all undistributed profits, and the right to be listed as co-founder. He didn't just want the money. He wanted the past rewritten without her in it. "You think I'll sign? I think you're tired." Derek looked at her server's uniform, then at the low-heeled shoes she'd bought from a discount store. For a long time, Nora's exhaustion was the thing he trusted most. He believed a person working 3 jobs, raising a child, and fighting a team of lawyers would eventually choose peace over the truth. Nora closed the folder. "You can keep the house. Keep my desk, my office, and the photos of you standing beside reports I wrote. But you can't keep my name." Derek tilted his head. "Whitmore doesn't know you the way I do. You never knew me." That was when Malcolm appeared at the end of the hallway. The Whitmore Fund was one of the fundraiser's sponsors, so Renee had received the guest list and called him the moment she saw Derek's name. Malcolm walked over, but stopped at a distance just far enough from Nora. He didn't stand in front of her, didn't take the folder, didn't ask what Derek had done. He simply stood there. Derek looked at him. "You do know she was paid to play your son's mother, don't you?" Malcolm didn't answer for Nora. He looked at her, waiting for a sign. Nora folded the agreement in half, put it back in the envelope, and pushed it back toward Derek. "Leave." The smile on his face disappeared. People can forgive a professional mistake. They'll find it harder to forgive knowing you took money to fake an identity in front of a room full of children. The next morning, the hotel manager suspended Nora's shifts while reviewing a complaint about her integrity. By noon, the delivery app locked her account pending document verification. At 3 in the afternoon, an envelope bearing the professional board's seal was slipped under her apartment door. Inside was a notice that they had just received additional documents related to the event at Hawthorne. Nora was still reading the final line when her phone buzzed. Her landlord's name appeared on the screen. At the same moment, from the living room, Maya asked why the hallway light had just gone out even though it wasn't dark yet. Nora looked at the wall switch, then at the strip of light that had disappeared beneath the apartment door. The power inside was still on. The hallway light, managed by the building, had gone out because its bulb had burned out the week before, but Maya had never noticed until now. Tonight, every small change made her think something else was about to be taken away. "It's just a light bulb," Nora said. The landlord hadn't called about the light bulb. He mentioned the unpaid rent and said he'd received a call requesting to verify Nora's employment. The caller hadn't given a name, only asked whether someone under investigation for dishonesty was still eligible to rent an apartment. He gave her another 7 days, not because he trusted her unconditionally, but because he'd seen Nora leave for work before dawn and come home after Maya was asleep. Sometimes kindness doesn't come from understanding the whole story. It only comes from having watched long enough to know who is trying. After the call, Nora put the board's notice in the bottom drawer. She heated soup, divided the last of the chicken into Maya's bowl, and said she'd already eaten at work. Maya didn't argue. She simply scooped half the chicken into the empty bowl across from her. "I'm full." The words came too quickly. Nora looked at her daughter. At 7 years old, Maya had already learned how to turn scarcity into a choice, so her mother wouldn't feel like a failure. Nora picked up the spoon and ate the chicken, though her throat could barely swallow it. She had once managed budgets so large that a rounding error alone could have covered years of rent on this apartment. Now, her daughter had to pretend to be full so her mother would eat dinner. That night, Nora waited until Maya fell asleep, then carried her jacket into the bathroom. She turned on the faucet to mask the sound of her crying. Not the violent kind that brings someone to their knees. Just breaths held too long, finally escaping, one at a time, in the small room with peeling paint beside the tub. Maya woke up but didn't call for her mother. She pulled the blanket up, turned to face the wall, and squeezed her eyes shut. Children sometimes pretend to be asleep because they're afraid the adults will know they've seen them weak. Maya thought this was how she protected Nora. That very thought made Nora cry longer. The next morning, Malcolm arrived just as she finished the last office cleaning shift she still had left. He stood by the curb, beside a black car with its engine off, holding a thin envelope. "Legal costs, rent, and Maya's program," Malcolm said. "Not alone." Nora didn't take it. Her wrists still bore the marks of rubber gloves. Over her shoulder was a bag of uniforms, holding the black apron next to the old blazer she still carried on the days she worked at the Whitmore house. 2 sets of clothes, belonging to 2 different lives, crammed together in one bag with a frayed strap. The latest second quarter 2026 labor figures show that women working full-time in management and professional roles have a median weekly income of $1,476. In the service occupations group, that figure is only $730. Nora had fallen through that gap without losing a single day's worth of knowledge. What had disappeared wasn't her competence, it was only the market's trust in her name. Malcolm said the amount in the envelope meant nothing to him. Nora believed him. That was exactly the problem. "You could pay off every one of my bills," she said. "But tomorrow, I'd still wake up inside a life arranged by you." Malcolm fell silent. Derek started exactly like that. He handled the small things. "Because I was too busy paying bills, talking to lawyers, keeping the shared passwords. By the time I noticed, he was standing between me and everything that had my name on it. I'm not Derek, I know. But if you decide for me just because you can, it feels the same either way." Malcolm looked at the envelope in his hand. Perhaps no one had ever turned down his money in a way that wasn't meant to make an impression. He tucked it back into his jacket pocket. "Then what do you need?" The question made Nora look up. Not how much she needed, not who he should call. He asked what she needed. Nora had thought about that all night. She needed a copy of the data before the lattice system was altered further. She needed a specialist who could recover the metadata without breaking the chain of evidence. She needed a lawyer who understood both corporate disputes and the board's procedures. And she needed to be paid what her work was actually worth. By afternoon, Simone Whitmore appeared in the library with 2 boxes of files and the expression of someone who didn't trust easily. She was Malcolm's sister, a lawyer who specialized in handling disputes where the wealthier side usually assumed they could drag things out until the other side collapsed from exhaustion. Simone didn't hug Nora, didn't say everything would be fine. She simply placed a new consulting contract in front of Nora, an hourly rate matching the expertise of a former chief financial officer. "My brother wants me to help you," Simone said, "but you have to run the financial side. I don't need a victim. I need someone who understands the system." Nora read every page before signing. 3 hours later, a data specialist connected in from New York. He explained that Lattice had once used an immutable storage system, since the company operated in healthcare and finance. The primary contract could be canceled, but audit logs still had to be retained for years. Derek could revoke daily access, but he couldn't easily order the compliance archive deleted. Simone pulled up the list of former vendors. Nora scanned through each name, then stopped at the 17th line. She pulled the laptop closer, typed in the account number she still remembered after nearly a year, and watched the screen display a notice that an offline archive, never deleted, still existed under the name of its original administrator. That name was Nora Bennett. The words on the screen silenced the whole room. Nora didn't touch the keyboard right away. She was afraid a hasty move could lose the thing that had been waiting for her for nearly a year. The data specialist asked everyone to log the time, take screenshots, and send a formal preservation request before attempting access. The archive required a security device registered in advance. Nora remembered a small silver key that used to hang with her office keychain. The day she left the house in Brookline, she had taken too little and left too much behind. She didn't know which box the device was in, or whether Derek had found and destroyed it. Simone warned that a piece of evidence existing didn't mean they could already use it. The device only confirmed Nora as the original encryption administrator. The vendor still had to grant temporary read access, log the access chain, and monitor the data retrieval process. It would take time. Time was the thing Nora had the least of. That afternoon, the after-school program called a third time. The overdue balance was still unpaid, and Maya would not be allowed to stay starting Monday. Nora was sitting amid contracts worth more than the building she lived in, yet still had to jot the amount owed on the edge of a scrap of paper. She planned to ask for extra weekend office cleaning shifts. If she worked through Friday night, she could deliver Saturday morning and sleep in the car before her evening serving shift. Nora had grown used to dividing her energy into small pieces, as though her body too were a budget that could be borrowed against and repaid later. By Monday, she arrived at the school early to pick up her daughter. The receptionist smiled and said Maya could still stay. The entire semester's fee had been paid. Nora froze. By whom? A grant for the program. 12 students are being supported. The move was very much like Malcolm. Generous enough that no one could call it helping one individual. Careful enough that Nora would look unreasonable objecting to it. He hadn't paid for her daughter alone. He had bought peace for an entire class, then hidden his decision inside an act of kindness. Nora found Malcolm in the greenhouse behind the Whitmore estate. He was repotting a rosemary plant, his shirt sleeves rolled to the elbows. Renee had already taken Oliver and Maya into the kitchen to wash their hands. Nora set the tuition confirmation on the table. You did this. Malcolm didn't deny it. He explained the program was about to cut several students due to lack of funding. The Whitmore Fund already sponsored the school. He had simply redirected money to where it was needed more. Everything he said was reasonable. That very reasonableness hurt more, because it turned her boundary into a small obstacle standing in the way of a good deed. You asked me what I needed, she said. I answered. Tools. Data. A contract paid at fair value. I never said you had permission to arrange the rest of my life. Malcolm leaned both hands on the table. For the first time, Nora saw his discomfort directed not at her, but at himself. This was a man who built companies by spotting problems and eliminating them as fast as possible. To him, delaying a solution felt almost the same as neglect. You were planning to work all night to cover that. That was my decision. And if you burn out? Still my decision. The space between them hardened. Nora knew she wasn't being entirely fair. She had turned independence into armor so heavy that even kindness got blocked outside it. But Malcolm had also used money to walk through a door she hadn't yet opened. When Oliver had a problem, I tried to make it disappear, Malcolm said. Camille promised and didn't show. I made up for it with trips, gifts, a better school. I thought if his life was full enough, he wouldn't notice the gap. Children always notice. I know. Those two words sounded tired, as if he had just called by its true name a failure he'd avoided facing for years. They wrote 3 principles on the back of the tuition confirmation. Any support directly involving Nora or Maya had to be asked about first. Community funding could not be used to bypass individual consent. If either of them felt the other was deciding on their behalf, they had to say so before the silence turned into resentment. Malcolm signed first. Nora held the pen but hadn't signed yet. One more thing, he said. Malcolm admitted he had wanted, many times, to ask her to dinner without a contract, files, or children sitting between them. But he didn't want Nora to have to wonder whether the invitation would affect her work. Nora looked at him longer than usual. Ask again when this is over. That wasn't a refusal. Malcolm understood. For the first time, he smiled without hiding what he wanted. From inside the house, Simone's phone rang. She stepped out into the hallway, her face no longer holding its usual composure. A copy of a transaction record the vendor had just confirmed in her hand. The payment had been approved by Nora's electronic signature at 2:14 p.m. on March 18th. At that exact same time, hospital records and hallway camera footage showed Nora standing beside a nurse outside Maya's emergency room, more than 17 miles from the Lattice office. Nora remembered that day very clearly. Maya had had a breathing attack in class, and the school nurse called just as Nora was about to walk into the quarterly budget meeting. She'd left her laptop on the desk, driven to the hospital in her gray suit, and sat for 4 hours beside the small bed with its metal side rails. Derek had texted saying he'd handle the meeting for her. That evening, he'd even brought coffee, kissed Maya's forehead, and told Nora not to worry about anything at the office. It was exactly then, while he stood in her office, that an electronic signature bearing Nora's name approved the first payment. Simone laid the hospital record beside the server log. Admission time was 1:38 p.m. The parking lot camera showed Nora's car entering at 1:26. The hallway camera also caught her speaking with a nurse at 2:13, just 1 minute before the transaction was signed from a computer in Lattice's East Conference Room. No one could be in two places at once. Nora didn't feel relief. She only felt cold. This first piece of evidence didn't return the months she'd lost. It didn't erase the nights Maya slept in the back seat while her mother made deliveries. But for the first time, her truth no longer existed only in the memory of someone others called bitter. The data specialist opened the detailed log. The authenticating device wasn't the computer Nora usually used, but a backup machine kept in the conference room. Access had been granted under Derek's admin account, then the system record was renamed to Nora's account. The change lasted 6 minutes before being reverted. The internal data had been deleted. The external archive had recorded both the old name and the new one. Over the next 2 days, Nora barely left the library. She traced payment after payment, cross-referencing contracts, vendor codes, and edit timestamps. 3 companies with different registered addresses shared the same mailbox. One was registered under Derek's cousin's name. The other was controlled by Taryn Ellis through a small trust fund. Malcolm brought food but left it on the side table. He didn't ask Nora to stop working, nor did he hover behind her. Whenever she looked up, she'd often see him helping Oliver with a model or reading files on the other side of the room, close enough that she knew she wasn't alone, far enough that the fight still belonged to her. Tuesday afternoon, Maya was brought home early because the after-school program had a staff meeting. She sat on the floor, opening the old business card box to find paper to draw on. Among the cream-colored cards were tutoring invoices, daycare receipts, and slips of paper Nora had stuffed inside during the months she no longer had a drawer of her own. Nora bent down to pick up a dropped invoice. She had once thought she'd failed because she couldn't pay for everything herself. But the numbers in that box told a story larger than her own life. According to 2022 federal data, depending on a child's age, the type of care, and where a family lives, full-day childcare costs range from $6,552 to $15,600 per year. That figure amounts to roughly 8.9 to 16% of a family's median income. For many parents, keeping a job doesn't depend on ability alone. It also depends on whether they can afford to pay someone to watch their child during the very hours they're earning money. Maya didn't know those numbers. She only knew there were weeks her mother picked her up late. Evenings her mother fell asleep still in uniform, and mornings Nora apologized for not being able to stay and watch her present in class. Maya flipped the box over, looking for a pencil. A small silver object slid out from a double layer in the bottom lining. Nora heard it hit the floor and shot up immediately. It was the old Lattice security key. Its casing was scratched, the metal loop bent. Nora remembered tucking it into the card box after a conference, afraid of losing it, then forgetting it entirely as her life fell apart. Maya had carried that box through their first rented room, a friend's spare room, and now this apartment. Where did you get this box? In your suitcase. Why did you keep it? Maya looked at the cards scattered around her knees. Because it has your name on it. Nora sat down on the floor. She hugged her daughter, one hand still gripping the silver device hard enough to hurt her palm. For nearly a year, she had thought she was fighting to reclaim her identity for herself. Only then did she understand that Maya, too, had lost a mother, even though Nora had never once left her side. The device was connected under the data specialist's supervision. It confirmed Nora as the original encryption administrator. After Simone completed the preservation request, the vendor granted temporary read access and logged the entire access process. The archive opened after a second round of verification. Inside was a version of the ledger backed up before Nora's access had been revoked, along with an edit history Derek hadn't managed to delete in time. Simone was scanning through the folder list when the printer behind her started running. A notice from the professional board had just come through. The formal review hearing was set for 12 days out. Attached was the list of witnesses Derek intended to call. The first name was Taryn Ellis. Taryn had sat to Nora's right in every budget meeting during her last 3 years at Lattice. She knew Nora's schedule, knew which computer was always left logged in, and knew Derek would protect her if everything came out. 12 days passed in nights of almost no sleep. Nora and Simone arranged the evidence chronologically, not to tell a heartbreaking story, but to reconstruct precisely, minute by minute, how another person had used her name to do something she never did. Malcolm didn't appear at the final meetings. He only texted asking whether Maya had eaten dinner, whether Oliver could come study together, and whether Nora wanted to drive herself or needed a car on the hearing day. He had learned to ask before helping. That morning, Nora wore the gray suit she'd worn the day she took Maya to the emergency room. Simone suggested something else, but Nora wanted the board to see the exact clothes she'd been wearing the moment the forged signature was created. A button on the inside had once fallen off and been re-sewn by Maya with mismatched blue thread. Nora left the clumsy, stitching as it was, another piece of evidence of where she had lived during the time she'd been forced into silence. The hearing took place in a room with 3 board members seated behind a long wooden table. Derek arrived with 2 lawyers and Taryn. He wore a light gray suit, the composed expression of someone who had spent years practicing how to make confidence look like truth. Maya didn't come into the room at first. She waited outside with Renee and Oliver, in an area with a drawing table and headphones. Malcolm sat in the back row, close enough for Nora to know he was there, but not so close as to turn her fight into a story about a billionaire stepping in to protect a poor woman. Derek's lawyer opened with the facts most likely to raise suspicion. Nora had lost her job. Nora worked several gig jobs. Nora had been paid to pose as a child's mother at a private school. Nora had a business relationship with Malcolm Whitmore during an ongoing dispute. Each individual truth was placed side by side, then bent into the image of an unstable woman willing to do anything for money. Nora sat still. She had spent nearly a year listening to others tell her life that way. They always started from where she had fallen, never from where she had once stood. Taryn was called first. She said Nora managed all financial access, often worked outside normal hours, and had a habit of approving transactions remotely. When asked about the March 18th payment, Taryn insisted Nora had said she would handle it after the budget meeting. Her voice was even, no stumbling. Simone didn't argue. She simply placed the hospital record on the table. Admission time, parking lot data, the hallway camera footage at 2:13, a photo from Nora's phone of Maya lying in the emergency room bed with an oxygen monitor on her finger. Taryn looked at the photo, then glanced at Derek. The moment was brief, but all 3 board members saw it. Simone continued with the storage vendor's log. Derek's admin account had renamed the device for 6 minutes. Nora's signature had been generated from the East conference room computer. Once the transaction was complete, the device name was reverted. The internal data was deleted. The offline copy was not. Derek's lawyer challenged the integrity of the data. Simone produced the vendor's certification, the preservation record, and an independently time-stamped access history. There was none of the murmuring from courtroom dramas. Only the sound of pages turning, a pen tapping the table, and a silence that grew heavier as one explanation after another ran out of room to exist. When it was Nora's turn, Simone stepped aside. Nora walked up to the screen. She didn't speak of the night she cried in the bathroom, didn't mention Maya pretending to be full, didn't bring up the nights spent sleeping in the car. She opened the original ledger and started from the very first transaction, explaining vendor codes, approval tiers, and the core process she herself had designed. Every payment passed through an intermediary company. Every company traced back to the same mailbox. One was registered under Derek's cousin's name. The other was controlled by Taryn. The invoices had been split just below the threshold requiring board review. After Nora was locked out of the system, the amounts nearly tripled. Derek cut in, saying Nora had once approved those very vendors. Nora pulled up the ledger version from before the edits. The original vendor names were completely different. For a few seconds, no one spoke. Derek stared at the screen as though the numbers had just betrayed him. But numbers betray no one. They simply sit there, waiting for someone patient enough to put them back in their rightful order. The board chair conferred with the 2 other members. Simone closed her folder. Taryn sat rigid in her chair, hands clasped together until they turned white. After nearly 40 minutes of deliberation, Renee was allowed to bring Maya in. The girl walked to the back row, clutching the old business card box against her chest. Malcolm didn't pull her toward him. He let Maya choose her own seat, the same way he had learned to let Nora choose her own path. The board chair opened a cream-colored envelope, adjusted his glasses, and looked straight at Nora. "Miss Bennett," she said, "we have reached a decision." Nora didn't take Simone's hand, nor did she turn toward Malcolm. Her hands rested on her knees, her palms still bearing small nail marks from clutching them too tightly for too long. In that moment, she wasn't thinking about shares, the house, or the money Derek had taken. She was thinking only of the business card in Maya's hand, the one still bearing the title she hadn't dared say aloud for nearly a year. The board concluded there was no evidence Nora had approved the transactions under investigation. On the contrary, the technical record showed her account had been used and deliberately altered. The license suspension agreement was revoked immediately. Nora's CPA license was fully reinstated. As the board chair read that line, Maya slid off her chair. She didn't run. She walked quickly down the aisle, holding the box against her chest as though carrying something fragile. Nora knelt down before her daughter reached her. Maya opened the box, took out a card still intact, and placed it in her mother's hand. "Can you use this name tomorrow?" Nora tried to answer, but no sound came out. She only nodded, pressing her forehead to her daughter's. Derek and his lawyers left through the side door. Lattice's board of directors later suspended his operating authority pending an independent audit. The misdirected funds had to be repaid, and Nora's equity dispute was moved to civil mediation, with the original ledger serving as the central piece of evidence. 3 months later, Nora's name appeared again in the company's founding records. She received her rightful share, the profits that had been withheld, and a settlement large enough that she wouldn't have to worry about rent for years. But when Lattice offered to bring her back with her old title, Nora declined. The glass office on the 17th floor was still there. So was the desk that had once been hers. Getting something back doesn't necessarily mean you have to go live inside it again. Nora rented a small office on the 2nd floor of a red brick building in Roxbury, not far from the neighborhood where her mother had worked 2 jobs to raise 3 children. The room held only 3 desks, a coffee machine that leaked constantly, and a window looking out onto a hair salon across the street. On the door, Maya stuck on yellow letters spelling out the name North Star Ledger. On opening day, Nora didn't stand on a big stage. She stood among folding chairs, in front of women carrying divorce papers, debt notices, job applications, and children coloring in the back of the room. Nora spoke about locked accounts, career gaps, and the feeling of having to ask permission just to touch one's own money. She referenced a report published in 2025 based on 2022 data. At the time, there were 13.9 million custodial parents living with 22.2 million children under 21, while the other parent lived elsewhere. Among those primary caregiving parents, 78.2% were women. Nora didn't read the numbers to make the room feel pity. She read them so the people in front of her would understand that their situation wasn't a private failure to be hidden away. Malcolm stood at the back of the room with Oliver. He didn't invest in North Star Ledger. Nora had turned him down. And this time he didn't try to route around it through another fund. He became her first client instead, paying the standard public rate for Nora to review his family's education fund structure. The first invoice was paid exactly on its due date, not early, with no gift attached. That evening, Malcolm brought up the invitation he'd been holding on to for months. They ate at a small restaurant with no assistant booking the table, no mention of Derek, and no talk of the education fund. In the months that followed, Nora learned how to let a man pursue her without treating his attention as a trap. Malcolm, too, learned that loving her didn't mean smoothing every path. Sometimes, loving someone is simply having enough patience to walk beside them while they choose their own direction. 1 year after the first family story night, all 4 of them returned to Hawthorne School. No contract, no role to play. Nora wore a cream-colored outfit she had bought herself, with the first money North Star Ledger had earned. When the teacher asked who would speak first, Oliver stepped up and said his family had a father who always tried to fix everything, a woman who always asked before helping, and a little girl who believed old paper could still become a star. After the program, Malcolm led Nora out to the small garden behind the school. On a wooden bench, he placed a thin glass frame in her hands. Inside was the paper star Maya had folded during that first interview. Beside it, a new business card. Nora Bennett, founder. North Star Ledger. "I didn't keep this to remind you of what was lost," Malcolm said. "I kept it because that was the night I met you, even before you remembered who you were." Nora looked at the frame. Out in the yard, Maya was calling her mother over to see a new drawing. Malcolm didn't kneel. He didn't take out a ring. He simply held his hand out to Nora, palm open, and asked whether she wanted to build something with him where neither of them would have to disappear inside it. Nora set the frame down on the bench, looked at the waiting hand in front of her, and slowly reached out her own. And as their fingers touched, Nora understood that a new beginning didn't mean handing her life over to someone else. It meant walking forward on her own 2 feet, beside someone who didn't try to lead the way for her, who didn't need her to be small in order to feel strong. There are losses that make us feel as though everything has been taken. Money, reputation, a job, a home, even the name we once wore with pride. But sometimes, What remains in the end is the thing that matters most. The ability to stand back up. The ability to choose. And the belief that the parts of us once folded away can still unfold into something more beautiful. What do you think of Nora's choice? Was she right to refuse letting Malcolm use money to solve every difficulty? Or is learning to accept help the right way also a form of courage? Leave a comment and share how you feel. Maybe you've known a woman who had to start over after a divorce, a lost job, or a betrayal. Maybe you yourself have lived through days when no one understood how hard you were trying. Your story could become the encouragement someone else needs to hear today. Thank you for staying with Nora, Maya, Malcolm, and Oliver until the very last moment. Thank you for believing that people still deserve a second chance, not to return to their old life, but to build a life that truly belongs to them. See you in the next story.